Welcome everyone to today's session on using AWS Firewall Manager to manage VPC Security Groups. I'm Venkat Vijayaraghavan. I'm a product manager at AWS. I'm one of the product managers who work in the Firewall Manager team. A quick agenda for the session today. For some of you who might be new to a Firewall Manager, we'll first discuss or talk about an introduction to what is AWS Firewall Manager. And then we'll specifically talk about Firewall Manager for VPC Security Groups. That's the new capability that we launched earlier this month. And then we'll also have some time for a quick demo and a walkthrough of how you go about using Firewall Manager for VPC Security Groups. And then we'll wrap it up all with some getting started resources. All right, with that, we'll just dive right into this. So what is AWS Firewall Manager? So Firewall Manager is more of a security configuration management tool that helps you centrally configure and manage your firewalls across your accounts and applications in your organization on AWS. So as it says, it's a way for you to make it easy to manage your firewalls, which could be WAF or Shield, and now security groups. So why do you need Firewall Manager in the first place, right? So one of the things that we constantly heard from customers is that often when they start using AWS and start growing on AWS, they often end up having a large number of accounts and large number of resources. And it was hard for them to manage security policies centrally across all these accounts and resources, because managing them centrally is key so that they can do that consistently. And then the other challenge that made this more challenging is that new applications were created all the time, and these new applications were built based on top of different AWS services. So there are some applications based on load balancers and others based on CloudFront and so on. So it was hard to know when new resources were created or new applications were created, and to protect them consistently starting day one when those applications or resources were created. So that was the other challenge we constantly heard from customers. And then lastly, often security administrators in these organizations wanted a single place to know about threats as and when they happen. So they wanted to be able to monitor and respond to any threats across their organization, across the application, as opposed to logging into each account and knowing or debugging threats within those accounts. So those are kind of the key reasons why we launched Firewall Manager in the first place. And then until today, or until recently, Firewall Manager was available on AWS WAF and AWS Shield. That means you could centrally enable baseline protections with AWS WAF and Shield DDoS protections across applications in your organization. So you can simply easily say, enable these common WAF rules, which could be your OWASP rules across your organization, or you could simply say, across my organization, I need to have DDoS protection enabled for all my internet-facing applications. And so you could simply enable Shield DDoS protections across all your applications. And Firewall Manager will consistently enforce those, even as new applications are created, or even as new accounts are created, and so on. And of course, Firewall Manager gives security administrators a centralized compliance posture to know which accounts are protected, which accounts are not protected, or which account resources and applications are protected and which ones are not protected. So it easily gives them this current snapshot of the security posture in their organization. And earlier this month, we launched support for VPC Security Groups, allowing you to configure or manage a WAF, Shield, and now security group rules across your organization. Now, going forward in this session, we'll talk about Firewall Manager and its support for VPC security groups. But before we talk about that, Let's quickly understand what is VPC security. Of course, we'll not talk about this in a lot of detail, but very quickly, VPC security groups, as you probably might already know, are a virtual firewall for your VPC EC2 instances. And VPC security groups allows you to create whitelist rules for what network traffic is allowed to your EC2 resources. And you can, of course, configure whitelist rules for traffic coming in, which is inbound rules, or traffic leaving your EC2 instances, or outbound rules. You can also configure multiple security groups for a particular EC2 instance, allowing you to create a robust set of security capabilities or security firewall for your VPC infrastructure. Now, because of how VPC security groups are configured and how often you end up using these security groups, there are these number of challenges that we can continuously hear from customers as and when they grow on AWS. One of them, of course, as we saw earlier, one of the challenges with managing security groups is that as you grow, there are a large number of applications in your organization. So that means you end up having a large number of security groups to protect these applications. And often, all these applications live across accounts in your organization. For example, you might have several accounts specifically created for your dev workloads and other accounts specifically for your production workloads. Or you might choose to segregate services based on the function. For example, you might have database services in one place and so on. And different application owners are isolated by accounts as well. So all these applications are often spread across accounts, and that means across these accounts there are these a large number of security groups now spread across your organization, and it becomes difficult to manage these distributed set of security groups without a single central place, and and security administrators find it hard to manage it without that place, especially when to be able to create such a place, often they have to set up cross account IAM permissions, which could be sometimes cumbersome, especially when you have large number of accounts and applications. So security administrators constantly ask us for the ability to easily configure common security group rules across all these applications and across all these accounts, so that with few clicks they can easily know that these baseline security groups are available everywhere, are deployed everywhere. Now, this challenge is not very unlike what we talked about earlier, which is even with PAF and Shield, this challenge exists that as customers grow and they have large number of applications, they're going to have this challenge of managing firewalls. However, with security groups, we saw and heard a different set of challenges in addition to sheer number. And those challenges have to deal with how customers use security groups, which is often security groups, unlike WAF, are owned by individual application owners. Often large organizations, while they want to apply some baseline security groups, they also want individual application owners to manage some of their own security groups so that they don't want to be bottlenecks for the application owners. So this means that it's hard for administrators to ensure consistency across applications. And because application owners create their own rules, they could create some very overly permissive rules. So it was important to audit these rules created by application owners. So administrators constantly asked us for the ability to set guardrails on what are valid or invalid security group rules in their organization. So that way they can say define the parameters within which the application owners can create security group rules. At the same time, security administrators also want to continuously monitor security group rules as opposed to doing an audit once in a month or once in a quarter. They wanted a way to continuously monitor it to prevent any overly permissive rules or detect in the first place overly permissive rules. And then the third challenge that we heard from customers is um, again constant changes in architecture or constantly new applications created. This means discovering new applications was a challenge in the first place because it was an operational burden to know when there are new resources created and and to constantly check for those changing security posture. So all of this was an operational burden for security administrators to keep up with. So these administrators often want a way to discover new resources as and when they are created, consistently enforce certain audit rules that the administrators defined, and more importantly, in some cases, automatically remediate any misconfigured rules so that eliminates any operational burden that they might have today. So these are some of these challenges. And to kind of sum up, security administrators want an easier way to configure common security groups, easier way to set guardrails for what sort of security group rules are allowed and what sort of security groups are not allowed, and continuously monitor them with these defined parameters so that as soon as somebody creates something outside of these defined parameters, administrators know when those rules are created. And then administrators want to discover new resources as and when they are created, consistently enforce rules on them, and lastly, automatically remediate misconfigured security group rules, which means if there are misconfigured rules detected, either remove them or modify them as appropriate. Okay, with that, now let's start talking about how does Firewall Manager actually help you do this. So these are some of the key pillars how we think about Firewall Manager, how Firewall Manager helps you achieve or helps security administrator achieve the or solve the problems that we just talked about. We'll look at each one of them in individually. Let's start talking about central management of security groups. So Firewall Manager is integrated with AWS organization. As you might know what AWS organizations is, which is easier way for you to manage across your organization in an account hierarchy. And AWS organizations makes it easier to manage those accounts for you. So Firewall Manager is natively integrated with AWS organizations. What this means is that you can simply designate one of the accounts in your organization as a Firewall Manager administrator, and that account can immediately start managing uh, uh, your firewall rules across WAF or Shield or security groups and do so across your organization. You don't have to worry about IAM permissions or anything else. Simply enable AWS organization's full features and designate an account as Firewall Manager administrator, and Firewall Manager takes care of the rest in terms of the permissions. So that in itself gives you the central management of security groups, and of course, central management of WAF and Shield as well. Now, in terms of the second pillar, Firewall Manager allows you to configure baseline of security group rules. So easily create and apply baseline rules from this central administrator account. So administrators can now create what Firewall Manager calls a common security group policy. This is just a type of policy you create in Firewall Manager, which enforces a set of baseline security group rules across your organization. So you simply create a master security group in the Firewall Manager administrator account and have Firewall Manager replicate that rule across a set of resources that you add inside the scope of a Firewall Manager policy. And we'll talk about this in more detail in a bit. And in addition to that, configuring simply replicating the security groups, administrators also have the additional options of allowing individual application owners or individual account owners to edit or add additional security groups in addition to the security group that the administrator configured. So for instance, if I, as an administrator, configure a security group across my organization, I can choose to know when individual account owners edited that security group, or I can choose to know when individual account owners added another security group in addition to the group that I just configured. And optionally, administrators can configure a firewall manager policy to automatically remediate it. So when somebody configured another security group, I can choose to, as an administrator, choose to say, I don't want anybody else creating another security group in addition to mine. Just delete those if you find those. Or I can automatically have Firewall Manager discover new resources and applications that were created or new accounts that were created and automatically add the baseline security groups on those as well. And there are several examples that we continuously hear from our customers like you. Uh, uh, Customers often want to allow SSH access from certain known corporate IP ranges, as opposed to allowing SSH to a broad internet, right? Or allow HTTP access from your ELBs on your ELBs, and do so only for the CloudFront IP ranges, or allow RDP access on your certain database servers, and so on. So these are several examples of where you can apply certain baseline of security group rules across your organization, so that and know that these rules will consistently be enforced even as new accounts and applications are created. Now, let's look at a demo of how you configure this common security group policy. But before that, there are some prerequisites for you to start using Firewall Manager. This might be more obvious to you if you're already using Firewall Manager, but some of you who might be new to Firewall Manager, so let's do a quick recap of these prerequisites. So, as I was talking about earlier, you need to enable AWS organization's full features to be able to use Firewall Manager. This as Firewall Manager as Firewall Manager integrates natively with organizations, this immediately allows Firewall Manager to have an administrator which has the permissions to manage security groups and WAF and Shield. So enable AWS organization's full features. And then you also need to enable AWS config on all your accounts in your organization. And this is required so that Firewall Manager knows about new resources that are being created in your organization. So Firewall Manager can listen to all those events happening in your organization. And you can easily enable config across all your accounts using CloudFormation and stack sets. And within a few minutes, you can get started with that. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier on, once you enable AWS organizations, you can also designate an account in your organization as a firewall manager admin or administrator. And that account can start using firewall manager and start creating policies. Now, what does creating a policy mean? Let's look at some of these basics again for some of you who might be new to firewall manager. So creating a firewall manager policy means you of course go to the firewall manager console or use the APIs to create a policy, and you add a set of security group rules that you want to replicate or that you want to use as a set of audit rules, and you attach these set of security group rules to this policy. And of course we'll actually see how we do this in our demo, but you create a set of security group rules in the firewall manager administrator account. The next step is for you to create a policy scope, which defines the blast radius or which defines the set of accounts that are included or excluded in the scope of this policy. And you also can optionally choose to specify tags, which defines the set of resources included or excluded in the policy. And these set of accounts and these set of resources that are included in the policy becomes the scope of the policy to which the security group rules or the baseline or the audit rules are applied to. So that means firewall manager monitors any resource in that scope. So in future, if a new resource was added with that particular tag, Firewall Manager will automatically discover those and add those rules to those resources as well. And same applies to the accounts as well. And lastly, you just review and create the policy, and Firewall Manager automatically replicates security group rules and starts monitoring the existing security group rules for any misconfigurations and so on. Okay, so with that introduction, let's actually start creating a common security group policy. So in this demo, we'll look at how you can create a common security group policy where I want to apply in my organization or allow in my organization SSH access from known set of corporate IP ranges, so that these corporate IP addresses can always SSH into these boxes in my organization. All right. With that, let's quickly move to the demo. Okay, so this is the Firewall Manager console, and you can find the Firewall Manager console on the AWS WAF and Shield console. So you can go to the WAF and Shield console, and you'll see within that there's a section for Firewall Manager, and there it is. So you can go to the security policies and create your own security policy. Now, you should remember that with Firewall Manager, when you create a policy, it is regional. That means it applies to resources in that particular region. So I'm going to create a Firewall Manager policy. And as we have been talking about, as I mentioned earlier, Firewall Manager supports 3 types of services: AWS WAF and AWS Shield Advanced, and now VPC Security Groups. Now, in this session, I'm going to show you how you can create a VPC Security Group policy. And once you choose a VPC Security Group policy, there are 3 types of sub-policies you can create. You can create a common security group policy, which we will do now. We'll come to the next 2 types of policies in a bit. Now I'm going to create a common security group policy. And again, to recap, this is a way for you to apply a baseline of security groups to a specified set of accounts and resources across your organization. And I'm going to create this common security group policy in Virginia. And once again, as we talked about earlier, with this common policy, you can add an existing security group and have that replicated across your organization. So I added this security group, and Firewall Manager will now replicate it across my organization. At the same time, before we go any further, I'm going to talk about these couple of different options that you have, which allow you to identify and revert any local changes made to the security groups once they are created. So once I create this policy, Firewall Manager will replicate the security group everywhere. But I can use this option to know when the local account owners or application owners edit that particular security group. Or I can also have myself notified when the local account owners create another security group on the same resource. And those are completely optional for you, by the way. Okay. Now, and then I have the option of configuring this policy in automatic remediation mode. That means as soon as it finds resources that are non-compliant, it's going to detect it and add the security group rules or remediate them as well. Okay. Go to next. And now that you attach security group to this policy, now it's time to define what is the scope of this policy. What are the resources that you want to include in this policy? So as we talked about earlier, you have a number of options. You can choose all your accounts in your organization. You can include a specific subset of accounts, or you can exclude a specific subset of accounts. And similarly, you can include specific resource types, or you can be more granular and then only include resources that have specific tags, um, and so firewall that allows you this granular control over what are the resources that are included in this policy scope. So firewall manager will only, or this policy will only act on resources in that scope. For now, I want to use a simple configuration. I'm going to include all my accounts. I'm going to include EC2 instances in all my accounts, and include all resources that match a source type EC2 instance. And that's it. This is just a option for me to review what we have created. And we're creating a common security group policy, which will replicate this security group across your organization. And it will do so across all my accounts in my organization and all my EC2 instances in my organization. And of course, as we briefly touched upon earlier, firewall manager needs config. So this is just a warning that you need to have enabled config for this policy to work. So I create this policy. Okay. Typically, it takes a couple of minutes for this policy to propagate and discover all the accounts and resources and apply the security groups or replicate the security groups everywhere. So while that propagates, I want to go back to our slide and continue with the some of the other things that I wanted to talk about, and then come back to this demo and see what the result was. And as you probably, okay, well, this is probably one thing that I should have talked about earlier. So what we did so far was in the demo security admin account, which is the designator firewall manager administrator account. I created created FMS policies, and each of these accounts have their own resources. And when I created this common security group policy in the administrator account, it's going to replicate the security group on EC2 instance 1 and EC2 instance 2, because all three accounts are included in the scope of my common security group policy, which I just created. So in a couple of minutes, we'll go back to one of these accounts and see that the EC2 instance 2 now has a security group policy, security group rule. And actually, let's go to the other child accounts console to show that right now it does not have the firewall security group created. So if you look at it, this is the instance in the child account, and it has a different security group. It's a local security group. Here we see that this new firewall manager security group was added just now. And this is the security group that was previously missing. And this is the security group that allows SSH TCP port 22, which is same as the security group from my demo policy, which is a security group that allows SSH TCP port 22. So now you can see how Firewall Manager replicated that security group across the child accounts. Now, previously, these three accounts were included in scope, and all three were marked non-compliant. Now that you can see that one of the accounts, child accounts, has the security group, it should quickly convert to compliant in a few minutes. As you see, there are 0 non-compliant resources. It's just a matter of updating the status here. We'll come to this in a minute. Now let me go back to my slide and then talk about the next type of policy, and we'll come back to that firewall manager common security group policy. The next type of security group policy that I wanted to talk about today was the policy that allows you to monitor existing security groups. Unlike the previous one, which is a common security group policy, which configures or replicates and creates new security groups. Monitoring existing security groups allows you to audit security groups and set guardrails on what is allowed and what is not allowed. So, and there are two types of such auditing policies you can create in Firewall Manager. One is a custom audit policy, another is a managed audit policy. So, as the name says, custom audit policy is a way for you to set custom guardrails on what security group rules can or cannot be created in your organization. The managed audit policies are pre-configured policies that we created for you based on what we have heard from other customers as to what is known to be misconfiguration. For example, today we have pre-configured policies to detect unused security groups or redundant security groups. So you can use this policy type to easily detect any unused security groups in your organization and easily have them removed. Once again, these audit policies do not create new security groups. It's just a way for you to know about misconfigured security groups or audit for misconfigured security groups. And just like the common security group policy, you have the option to automatically remediate when misconfigured security groups or rules are discovered. And when you want Firewall Manager to auto remediate, Firewall Manager will remove those security groups or security group rules as appropriate. So some of the examples for this policy type are you can previously we looked at how you can configure a common policy to allow SSH from a known set of corporate IP addresses, but that does not prevent anybody else from adding another rule that opens port 22 for a wider set of IP CIDR blocks. So now you can create an audit policy that allows SSH only from certain corporate IP ranges. Similarly, you can allow HTTP access only on your ELBs, or you can make sure that only port 443 is allowed across your infrastructure. And similarly, you can use the managed policies like unused security groups or redundant security groups and simply easily know when such security groups are created and have Firewall Manager clean that up for you. So now with that context, let's quickly look at how you create an audit policy. And in this example, I will walk you through how you can create a audit policy or custom audit policy that will allow me to specify or define a guardrail, which is allow only HTTPS or port 443 on all my EC2 instances. So I want to mandate that only 443 is open as an inbound rule across my EC2 instance. And once again, going back to my organization structure, I have this administrator account, and in my other two accounts, in EC2 instance 1 and EC2 instance 2, I have a couple of security groups already pre-created so that it's easier for this demo. One of them has port 443 open as an inbound rule, and another has port 80 as an inbound rule. So as soon as I create in a Firewall Manager, administrator creates a policy that checks for port 443 or mandates that only port 443 can be open as an inbound rule, while in EC2 instance 1 is compliant, EC2 instance 2 is non-compliant. And we should be able to see, Firewall Manager should be able to detect that this account is non-compliant and let me know that state. So let's go to the console now. And before I create an audit policy, I want to quickly recap the demo FMS policy that we created a few minutes ago. As you see, the demo policy created a common security group across 3 protected accounts, which are the 3 accounts in my organization. And it was able to successfully create those security groups across these 3 accounts. There are no resources that are compliant, no resources that are non-compliant, and I can drill into that policy and look at all 3 accounts that were compliant. And as I showed you previously, the security group was this security group with SSH port 22 was created and attached to this EC2 instance as well. Okay, now once again, now let's create a custom audit policy, which will mandate that across my organization, I only allow port 443 rules to be created. And okay, I'm going to continue creating this in, actually, let me go back and talk about this for a minute. So I'm not creating a common security group policy. I'm creating an audit and enforcement of security group policy. This will check and manage existing security groups and rules in your organization. It will not create new security groups. Let's create an audit policy. Okay. And in this policy, I want to define rules that are allowed in my organization. So I'm going to choose from an existing set of security group rules. And I'm going to choose the test audit. I'll show you what is the content of that security group. And these are all this existing security groups, by the way, in my VPC in this region. I'm going to add the security group to this policy. And I'm going to choose to not auto remediate this time. I'm going to show just how Firewall Manager works in a manual remediation case. And as I said, I'm going to only allow rules defined in this security group. And I want to include all my EC2 instances, just like the previous case. I'm going to include all my EC2 instances across all my accounts in my organization. I'm not going to use any tags for now. Okay, so this is the security group that I used, and as the inbound rule says, I want to check for HTTPS TCP port 443. That means that's the only security group rule that is allowed for EC2 instances. EC2 instances should not have any other inbound rules open. So that's the policy I'm creating right now. And as I showed you before, this instance has the FMS webinar security group, which allows port 80 in my on this particular instance. So it should mark this account as non-compliant. So let's go back and create the security group. Sorry, create this audit policy in Firewall Manager. Okay. Again, it's going to take a few minutes to propagate and discover all the accounts and resources and mark this particular account that I showed you as non-compliant. So once again, we'll give this a minute or two to happen. And while it happens, I'll come back to my slide and then talk about next type of policy that I wanted to talk about. The next thing I wanted to quickly talk about was detecting non-compliance and remediation. So I showed you how in the common security group policy, we chose to automatically remediate. So Firewall Manager not only discovered the resources, but it also added the security groups to those resources. So it took an action to make sure that those resources are not compliant. But in this case, in the audit policy that we just created, I chose to not automatically remediate. So you have both those options. Firewall Manager policies continuously audit the security groups, and fire administrators get the notifications of any non-compliance, but you can optionally choose to automatically remediate or not automatically remediate. If you automatically remediate, Firewall Manager will take the action as soon as the non-compliance was detected. So when an audit policy is detected to be non-compliant, Firewall Manager will immediately remove that misconfigured rule. So one of our recommendations is that when you configure an audit policy, we recommend that you first enable or create that policy in a manual remediation mode. Check what sort of non-compliance uh, Firewall Manager detects, and what are the accounts and resources where non-compliance is detected, and manually remediate those once you know for sure that you want to remove those rules. Because that could have, if you blindly remove rules, it could have an adverse effect on your applications. Okay, so we'll quickly look at some of the remediation workflows as well. So as we do that, let's quickly move to the console, and I'll show you. Let's quickly see if this pending policy has propagated. That will allow me to show you some of the remediation workflows. Okay, this one is still in pending state. It probably needs a couple of minutes. Oh, there it is. So as you see, the demo custom audit policy has 3 accounts in scope, and it has 1 non-compliant account. So let me go to that details of that policy. So I can see that this particular account is non-compliant, and one of the instances it says violates the audit security group policy, so it's non-compliant, and that is because in the and this is the instance that violates it because I have this other security group um, that has port 443 open, sorry, port 80 open, and it's not a valid um, port as per my audit policy. So what I'm going to do is uh, change this to, or delete this rule, and within a few minutes, this instance is going to go or become compliant because there's no non-compliant rules anymore. And again, this is going to take a minute or two to detect. So while that happens, I'm going to show you the remediation workflow. So to show the remediation workflow, I'm going to use the managed audit policy, which I pre-created. So as you might recall from my earlier discussion, a managed audit policy is a pre-configured set of policies that we create, which easily detects um, uh, unused or redundant security groups. So I already created this for you. So here, as I'm going to edit this and show the details here, um, as it says, um, this policy detects any unused um, uh, uh, policies. That means security groups within this policy scope must be used at least once, and this also, you can also choose to detect non-unique or redundant security groups, and this applies to all resources. But I excluded my one of my accounts just to show how the configuration looks. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is that this uh, policy is non-compliant. Let's dig into that to understand why. And looks like there are multiple security groups in this that are in scope of this policy that are unused in this context. So let's look at why those policies are, or why the security groups are unused. So I'll go to my child account and show you the list of security groups. As you see, I already created these unused security groups. These are like, I have only one instance, and that instance is not attached to any of these first 3 security groups. So that's why we have these 3 security groups that are called out as unused. So I'm going to come back, and however, I marked this policy to be not auto remediate. So as you see, if I edit the policy, this policy is configured to not automatically remediate. That's why Firewall Manager gave me that notification and gave me the visibility that these policies are not compliant. But now I'm going to convert that. I'm going to switch that to automatically remediate. So Firewall Manager is going to not only detect it, but in a quick few minutes, it's going to remove those unused security groups. Okay. While this happens, as I said before, coming back to the common audit policy, we previously had this one non-compliant account that's now compliant because I removed that security group rule that allowed traffic on port 443 inbound. Now, all my accounts in my organization are compliant to this particular audit policy because none of them are using anything but uh, inbound rule on port 443. Okay, so once again, we'll give this uh, webinar the usually managed policy a few minutes to propagate, and once it does, it's going to mark this other account compliant as well by removing those unused security groups. So while that happens, let's proceed with our slides and wrap that up quickly. And firewall manager pricing. I mean, this is often one of the questions that you might have. So firewall manager charges $100 per policy per region, and this applies to any type of policy that you create, and applies to a VPC security group policy as well. So that means a common security group policy or audit policy that you create. Each of these will incur a charge of $100 per policy, and there are no limits on how many accounts you can manage under any of these policies, or how many security groups are added to any of these policies, and or how many resources are managed under any of these policies. You don't have to worry about any of that. You only pay per policy, irrespective of how many accounts or resources are in scope. And here are some resources for you to get started. You can visit the AWS Firewall Manager documentation. You can view the Jeff Barr blog post on some of the step-by-step instructions on how you can create a common audit policy. And of course, you can visit the Firewall Manager website for more details. Firewall Manager is available on several AWS regions, and we continue to add Firewall Manager in some of the new AWS regions, and we'll continue adding those as and when AWS launches those new regions. So with that, we can wrap up today's session, and we'll wait for you to ask any questions. I already see several questions come up, and we'll stand by and answer those questions in a few minutes.